This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
Additional support provided by
The secret to quality fermentation is White Labs. Core strains are made weekly and most can ship out the next day. Order through the White Labs app or yeastman.com. Visit whitelabs.com/whywhitelabs for a new customer special offer. That's whitelabs.com/WHY Whitelabs.
I remember coming in one day after Christmas, and it was extremely cold in our cellar, and 5 of the 10 tanks were leaking all at the same time because we were not monitoring the humidity.
This week on the show, Jace Marti tells us how his 159-year-old family-run brewery makes Berliner Weisse. You'll hear all about the various production methods for this unique beer style, as well as all of the complexities, trials, and tribulations that come with the territory. August Schell isn't your typical modern craft brewer. The brewery is actually older than Master Brewers. Give us a little background on the brewery and its Berliner Weisse endeavors.
Yeah, first a little bit about the brewery. We're located in New Ulm, Minnesota. We are the second oldest family-owned brewery in the country. We were founded in 1860. We have grown quite a bit over the years. We now make about 120,000 barrels of beer a year. And I know with the latest rankings from the Brewers Association, that puts us at 25th in the country. Our primary focus is on lager beers and German beers. I guess in general, we're very proud of our German heritage, and we've really made that a focal point of the beers that we produce. But starting in 2012 was when we started our Berliner Weisse program.
Cool. And how long have you been there?
I've been there my whole life. It's family business, so I kind of grew up in the brewery. I've been working, even before high school. I got to do a lot of crappy odd jobs that my dad wouldn't make anyone else do, so I got to learn the ropes that way. And then through high school, I worked in the bottle house, and then once I got back from college, I've been working full time at the brewery. So
that's awesome.
18 years now.
Not a bad way to grow up.
Yeah.
Okay, well, like most beer styles, the variety of products under the Berliner Weisse umbrella has become more expansive and complicated over the years. So I'm wondering, what does Berliner Weisse mean to you?
Yeah, in a little bit more historical context, for me, Berliner Weisse, it was kind of a pet project that started from home brewing, and also with the unique thing that we had at the brewery. And then we had these old wooden tanks, and we were coming up on our 150th anniversary at the time. This is in 2008, and I really wanted to use these wooden tanks that we still had in our cellars. We had 2 of them that were still in the cellars at the time, and we hadn't used them since the early 90s. 1991 is when we decommissioned them. And I just thought it'd be really cool if we could make a beer in it again, just as part of the anniversary celebrations. And we really didn't know what we were doing, so it took a long time, and we kind of missed that window. But that's when kind of shifted focus, and Berliner Weisse was kind of the new end goal with those tanks. I had been into homebrewing sours at home because obviously we couldn't do it at the brewery, and Berliner Weisse was just this obscure style that I kind of fell in love with, became obsessed with, and thought it would be cool to, now that we had these tanks restored, to make Berliner Weisse in these tanks. It was relatively unknown at that time even, and I thought with our focus on German beers and German heritage that it would really fit well with what we're doing and kind of have this special, unique product that we could introduce at the brewery.
Tell us a little bit more about the style itself and also how you learned to make it.
Yeah, definitely. So Berliner Weisse, like I said, back then it was relatively unknown. I had read about it through, finding little snippets here and there in books and from what I can understand. But where I got my information from was from my time at the VLB and my teacher, Kurt Marshall and Bergott Meyer. They were both the ones that really did a lot of the education. So a lot of this information comes from them. I just wanted to acknowledge that. And really, I have them to thank for all of what we've done here at Schell's. But it's a top fermenting beer, traditionally made with barley and wheat. And it was produced via a mixed culture fermentation. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae, just a top fermenting ale yeast, no real specific mention of it, and then the key being lactic acid bacteria. These are low gravity beers, 7 to 10 Plato, and had a fairly high content of lactic acid. And then they were also traditionally bottle conditioned, and with that was the use of a secondary fermentation yeast, and that's Brettanomyces. And that really what gave that beer its characteristic flavor. Brettanomyces is a super attenuator, so it really dried the beer out. You ended up with a highly carbonated beer. Usually with the addition of wheat, you had a thick, stable foam head. And then you had this, refreshing, tart yeast, Brett yeast kind of aroma to it that was like apple-y, cidery. And it was also very flavor stable because of that high acid content.
There's basically 3 different approaches to brewing Berliner Weisse. There's sequential, parallel, and mixed. Before we get into how August Schell does it, let's run through those possibilities.
Yeah, so the 3 different methods, this is kind of what I've, for the sake of kind of explaining it to people, I try to talk about these 3 different production methods for Berliner Weisse. And these go back to when kind of the high point of Berliner Weisse, turn of the century in the 1900s, when it was being produced by over 40 breweries just in the city of Berlin. And it was really, a very, in vogue type of beer, right before, anyone that has ever read a history book knows what happens next. But, so yeah, a lot of this information kind of comes from the research that I could and research I could find. So the first one, and I think this is the one that's probably most familiar with craft brewers today, would be the sequential production or the Franca acidification method. And so this method is what we know as kettle souring. So you take unhopped, unboiled wort, you add a pure culture of lactobacillus, where you do your acidification inside the kettle. Once you hit your target pH or total acidity, you bring it up to a boil, you heat sterilize it, cool it back down, you pitch a regular brewer's yeast, and then fermentation is like a regular beer, and you package it. There's no mixed culture fermentation. It addressed the difficulty of having that, potential spoilage throughout the brewery with bacteria and wild yeast. You could finish it just like a regular beer, and it was ready to consume quickly. And what's unique about this method is that it was patented by a brewery, this Franca, and it never really gained popularity in the city of Berlin. There are some old ads, if anyone's ever read Ron Pattinson's blog. I know he has it where it's listed in there where they were advertising the Franca acidification method, and I believe that brewery went out of business within 2 years, just because it lacked that characteristic aroma that you got from the other 2 methods of production.
Is that why we think that didn't really catch on, just because the aroma was different?
Yeah, but what's unique about this is that because it was written about, because this brewery had patented it, it's very well documented in the historical context, even though it never really caught on. It was kind of this weird anomaly that it was written about a lot, never really used, but then when you try and recreate this traditional style and you start to do research, well, you think that this was the way that it was done. And so it's kind of spun off into this whole new style of brewing here in the United States based on what we think is traditional, even though it never really was. And I think that's always kind of an interesting point I like to bring up in talking about the history of Berliner Weisse.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Kindle is obviously a well-known producer of the next method. So let's hear about their approach.
So this would be the parallel production method, and this is what people always think Kindle does is they Kindle sour, but that they kettle sour. But it's actually what they do is quite a bit different. They take unhopped wort and they split it. They do one pure culture lactobacillus fermentation, and then they take the other half of the wort, boil it with hops, and they do a pure culture yeast fermentation with a brewer's yeast fermentation. Then they blend the two together to hit their target pH or acidity, and then they sterile filter it and package it. This is kind of based on the Barak production method, and it's usually about a 20% blend of that lactic acid fermentation blended with their regular beer. And it's in a sense like kettle souring where you're fixing your focus is on the acid level and you're fixing that level. But instead of heat sterilizing it, they're using a filter to sterilize it there. And then there's no additional bottle conditioning or re-fermentation inside the bottle. The beer is completely sterile at that point. And that's, from what I understand, is the method that's employed by Kindle.
You mentioned Ron Pattinson earlier. We had him on the show back on episode 71, and he was pretty critical of Kindle and this method. What's the downside with doing it this way?
I mean, I'm not gonna say bad things about Berliner Weisse breweries that are, true breweries, but I think, or some people's criticisms in Ron's is that it doesn't have that full rounded bouquet that was characteristic of classically made Berliner Weisses. It's maybe one-dimensional and very focused on just the acid element of it, and it's also kind of made to be mixed with syrups. So it's extremely acidic. If you ever get a chance to have one unblended, it's very, very acidic because it's made to be have that sweet raspberry woodruff syrup added to it, so you get this sweet sour thing going on, almost kind of like an alcopop essentially. It makes for a very cool looking beer in a beer garden, but I think the purists will disagree in the the flavor of that style of Berliner Weisse.
Okay, well, tell us about the third method, which is the sort of the classic mixed production.
Yeah, so the mixed culture fermentation method is one that was probably most widely used in Berlin, and the one that people, historians or purists would say produced a true, authentic Berliner Weisse. And this could have been, done any number of different ways within each brewery, but the basic thing is that you take a hopped unboiled wort, you pitch a mixed culture of yeast and bacteria, and then after a short primary fermentation, it's an ale yeast, so maybe a week, it goes straight into bottles for bottle conditioning, and with that you have your Brettanomyces in there, and that bottle conditioning usually 8 weeks or so, and that's where the characteristic flavors begin to start to develop.
There's little to no wort boiling in this method. Why is that?
Because you want some acid production. Hops are antibacterial, and so it's really counterproductive to boil it with hops because you're trying to make something that's acid. That's why hops were used, to obviously prevent bacterial spoilage, you could say. So this is a way, like Belgian beers, where you're using very sparse amounts of hops, or like in the case of Belgians, they're using aged hops where you're getting very small amounts of bitterness contribution because you want the bacteria to flourish inside this beer.
Talk about the difference in strategies. Some brewers are doing a hold above 180 Fahrenheit, and others are actually doing a brief wort boil. What's the difference in strategy there?
Yeah, so Dr. Schoenfeld, who did a lot of research, he was the director of top fermenting beers at the VLB. He kind of championed that even though you're not boiling it, because boiling, precipitates proteins, and that's, you want this beer to have a very thick, stable foam head, and also because bacterial has proteolytic capabilities. By bringing the wort up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, or even just a quick boil, that was a way of preventing any bacteria that may be on the husks of the barley or the wheat. You're kind of killing those off, and you're only using the bacteria that you want in the fermentation.
Schultheiss, which is now part of Berliner Kindle Schultheiss Brewery, which occupies Berlin's last remaining industrial brewery, had its own twist on the mixed production method. Let's hear about that.
Yeah, so Schultheiss is the one that people, if you've ever read Michael Jackson's book, he just would, wax poetically, glow about how great the Schultheiss Berliner Weisse was. And Ron Pattinson as well. They both pointed to this one as being the classic example of what a Berliner Weisse should be. And Schultheiss used this classic mixed culture fermentation method, although they had a little bit of a twist to it. What was unique with them is they would start with, again, unhopped or hopped unboiled wort, very lightly hopped. They targeted about 5 IBUs using a hop extract. And then they would pitch a mixed culture of top fermenting yeast and Lactobacillus delbrueckii in an open fermenter. But they would also at that same time add a small portion of 3 to 6 month old beer that was blended in, and that was used to preserve the characteristic. It was almost like making sourdough bread, where you're adding a small portion of the aged one to kind of guide the flavor profile. It would ferment 3 to 4 days, kind of in a traditional ale fermentation temperature. And then it would go into a secondary ripening in their conditioning cellars, where it would age from 3 up to ideally 12 months or so. At, again, slightly warmer temperatures, room temperature or so. And then that's where it would get that characteristic aroma, and the acidity would build as well. So say after 12 months, the beer would then be packaged where it was krausened with 1 day old fermenting beer, and they would also add another fresh pitch of Lactobacillus delbrueckii at bottling. The beer is bottled then. They would bottle condition it, say 4 weeks or so, and then it was ready to drink once it left the brewery. But what was unique about the Schultheiss is that not only had this beer been aged for an extremely long time, and it was only 3 to 3.5% alcohol, people that really were big fans of this style would keep these bottles, say, for 1 to 2 more years, in a cellar or something, because they knew that the beer would continue to develop over time. And that's where it really got its, estery fruitiness and acidity and very, that fine fragrant aroma that it was known for.
Talk about some of the challenges that come along with the classical mixed production method.
Yeah, and with this classical method that the purists said produced the best version, there's a reason why these other methods were developed, and it's because it also came with a lot of problems. Inconsistency is a big thing. You're dealing with a mixed culture fermentation. It's really hard to keep a stable mixed culture going generation over generation over generation. That's why you see with like Schultheiss testing that and adding back older beers and also repitching fresh bacteria at bottling. That was definitely a problem, inconsistency. And then the variability with carbonation levels. You're dealing with Brett, which was not at the time very well understood at the turn of the century, and so overcarbonation was definitely an issue, and that's why you see in the old pictures they have these massive glasses, because they knew that the bottles generally when they pour them in the glass would just foam up like crazy, and so you needed this oversized glass that almost some of them looked like dog bowls or like just giant chalices that you'd see were just completely like a head of a cabbage inside of it. So overcarbonation was definitely an issue, and that clearly was addressed through the glassware, but you knew that was a problem all the time. And then reproducibility. Again, with just mixed culture and the variability of Brett, it's really hard, and I can speak from experience that it's really hard to reproduce beers when you're dealing with all these different organisms that behave differently and ferment and reproduce at different rates. So reproducibility was definitely an issue. But the flip side of that, for modern day craft brewers, is that's also people view that as a positive. Having different versions, and experimenting with different Bretts and different levels of acidity, how the flavor evolves over time. People embrace that these days. And so I think there's also a lot of opportunities with this classical production method because of, the unknowns and the variabilities and stuff like that. So that's why one of the reasons that we focus on the classic mixed culture method, and I think where it's really exciting, and there's a lot of different ways you can take this style.
Brewers take very different approaches when they attempt to brew styles like this. Some people value authenticity above all else. Others are more concerned with optimizing certain flavors. And of course, anyone has to consider what is realistic given their equipment and resources. How did August Schell first approach the prospect of brewing Berliner Weisse?
Yeah, for us, it was really based on in who we are as a brewery, and that's what we use to kind of guide ourselves in our journey of making Berliner Weisse. And we are a traditional brewery. That's something we're very proud of. And so for us, making it the traditional mixed culture way was the way we were going to go about doing it. And that's not to say that the other methods are right or wrong. And I think that's a great thing about Berliner Weisse is it can be a lot of different things depending on what you want it. You can, we age our beers 1, 2, 3 years, and it's almost more wine-like, champagne-like, or you can have a very, light, refreshing kettle sour that is simple and easy to drink and dumped with lots of fruit or hops and crazy flavors. And that's, another way of taking it too. So Berliner Weisse can really cover a wide spectrum of flavors. And even if going back to what traditional levels of acidity were, that beer was meant to be drank fresh. It was a refreshing, workman's beer, low alcohol, lightly acidic. It was just an everyday drinking man's champagne, you could say. So I think Berliner Weisse can be a lot of different things, and it all depends on what you want it to be.
Not every beer has to make Ron happy, right?
That's true. Yeah.
Coming up,
you get this weird stretch where the primary culture starts to die off, and you get some of those autolysis flavors, and you start to sweat a little bit on thinking you screwed some stuff up. But you just got to be patient, and that's when the magic starts happening.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Bring the world to your brewhouse with BSG's diverse selection of ingredients and services. Our dedicated customer service team and industry experience provides you with the assistance you need every step of the way. Make BSG your supplier of choice with products essential to making great artisanal beverages so you can stay focused on your craft. Visit us at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact us at 1-800-374-2739.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Rocky Mountain meets at Red Truck Beer Company in Fort Collins May 21st. And District Northern Illinois meets at Half Acre Beer May 31st. Don't miss the CO2 monitoring and the Brewery and Brewpub webinar June 13th. District Philly's annual golf outing is June 14th. And District Midwest meets at Wolf's Ridge Brewing in Columbus June 29th. It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. Check out the full count of events at MBAA.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. You guys are using Cypress tanks at August Schell, and that's probably not the first thing that comes to mind for most brewers who set out to make Berliner Weisse. Where did that concept come from?
Yeah, so our program is definitely unique. in the fact that all of our beer is aged in what we now refer to as foeders, but they were our cypress wood lagering tanks. We have 10 of these big, beautiful tanks. They're 140 barrels each. And they were built inside the brewery in 1936. They were built by Dunk Tank Works out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Dunk Tank, like the dunk tank we associate with. But they were, we're a lager beer brewery. We were making American lagers, and so they were Cypress because Cypress doesn't have the flavor contribution that oak does. And it's also extremely resistant to decay, which is probably the reason we're still able to use these tanks today. But they were also pitch lined, and because we were trying to, keep that flavor out of our regular lager beers. And, when it came time to kind of shift focus and like, all right, we're going to make sour beers, I really drew my inspiration from Rodenbach. They're similar sized tanks. If anyone's ever seen pictures of them, they're absolutely beautiful. But I think a lot of that, classical mixed culture fermentation method is very similar to what a Flanders Red is like being produced at Rodenbach, although different malt bills and slightly different target outcomes. That's kind of how I approached this with trying to use these wooden tanks, and it was a massive undertaking trying to get these tanks back into usable production. But it was definitely a pet project that was quite a bit of fun. When we first started, these tanks had been empty for over 20 years and they were extremely dried out. I could literally stick my hands, slide my fingers through the gaps in some of the staves. They were in tough shape, but with consulting some advice from a local cooper here in Minnesota, gave us some pointers on what to do. And slowly over the course of, the first one took about a year to restore. We finally got it to hold liquid, and then we had them dry ice blasted to remove that wax lining that I talked about, to expose that wooden surface. I really wanted to have that exposed wood because we wanted to create that microflora environment of that. We weren't looking for a sanitary surface, and wood was also very traditionally used in the older method. So again, trying to be traditional in using the wood, but also using a piece of our history in a completely new and different way than they were originally intended for.
So you didn't do the entire cycle in the Cypress tanks. You had to put some other equipment into service for this project as well, right?
Yeah. So the way we do it, where these wooden tanks were, we're kind of in an abandoned cellar. And so when we started off making the beers, we kind of had to use a hybrid method of the Baroque method and the traditional mixed culture method. And that was because we didn't have, we had 2 stainless steel tanks in there that we weren't using in addition to the wooden tanks, but they were not big enough to ferment the whole batch of beer in it. So I thought it would be interesting to just use one of them to do that pure culture lactic fermentation. And then we would ferment the other half in one of our regular ale tanks. And then we would blend the two into our wooden tanks, but we were not sterilizing either one of them. We were just, it's almost like making a massive lactic acid pitch from half of the batch and then blending that into the wooden tanks. And that's, at that blending, we would then pitch Brettanomyces. From there, we would go through an extended secondary maturation. The beer would continue to acidify over time. The Brett would start to dry it out. We'd watch the gravity drop and the flavor and aroma development. And it was all dependent on when the pH, total acidity, and gravity would all kind of stabilize. And then the flavor would get to a place that we liked, based on the acidity and also the aroma. From there, we would go back into that single stainless steel tank that we had. And that's when we would use that for a bottle conditioning tank. We would pitch fresh yeast and sugar, and then it was all, or I shouldn't say it was, it is all then hand bottled where it undergoes a bottle conditioning.
All right, that's pretty cool. Well, let's dig into the details a little bit. So starting off from the brew house, anything special with the grist or with mashing?
Yeah, so we use, say for just a traditional version, we use a high portion of wheat in all our most of our recipes, as that was traditional. And in Berlin, back in kind of its heyday, they would use bread making wheat, something that was extremely high in protein. So we've actually had a wheat malt, chit wheat malt, custom made for us that is about 14.5% protein, and it goes through a 2-day germ process. So highly under modified and high protein content, and that's really to working on the foam, preserving the foam. But we go through a 3-step mash, 140 degrees, 165, then 172. Very short. We don't want to dry the beer out too much, although as I get more and more into it, I think actually drying the beer out is beneficial. And I can get into that a little more later, but and we always do a decoction mash. We have the capability at a brewery. That was something, I know it's heavily debated on whether it's beneficial or not, but it was traditionally done. And I think for a beer that you're going to age for 2 years, an extra 20 minutes, half hour in the brew house is nothing in the grand scheme of things. So we always do a 10 and 20 minute decoction mash depending on the beer. But with that, usually with that high portion of a under-modified wheat, we do have some lautering issues. So a lot of rice hulls in the lauter tun, and I usually am not anybody's friend in the brew house during that day. So it's always a challenge in the brew house, but we do not boil. So, you're saving some time that way as long as you can run it off in a fairly reasonable amount of time. But one of the things that's unique to us being in Minnesota, this happened from experience. We've now gone to a 1 minute, we call it a kettle roll, where one of the early batches we did, it was in the middle of winter, it was extremely cold, and our kettle is split over 2 levels in our brew house, and it was saying, -10 that day. It was really cold.
So you just couldn't get it above 180 even?
Well, we thought the temp probe was in the middle of the kettle. The bottom of the kettle never got above 180. And I mean, the next day that beer was just rancid. It was the most foul smelling, rotten cheese you've ever smelled. So we dumped it and we changed it to, all right, we're going to do a 1 minute kettle roll just to make sure that we're at sterilization temp. So we bring it up to 212, roll the kettle, and then we hold it for 20 minutes just for sterilization. We very minimal hopping, target's always 4 to 5 IBUs. We have 2 different lactic acid strains lactobacillus strains that we use. And so depending on what we're trying to achieve, we can adjust that bitterness up or down. And we just use hop extract because, again, we're not boiling. It's very easy to dial in our IBUs, and it's such a minimal contribution to the flavor profile. I mean, it's basically none. So to hit your IBUs and know that you're going to get to a desired acid level, I think that is very beneficial. Once the beer is finished, where we started off first was inside the brewery.
Before we jump into that, talk about, 'cause I noticed you said you do a pH adjustment in the brew house there. Talk about that a little bit, because that seems a little interesting, especially given what's about to happen.
Yeah, so once we get over the kettle, we do a pH adjustment, and this comes from experience and also talking with Kurt Marshall and some of the historical data. We use a lactobacillus brevis strain that is extremely proteolytic, and it just destroys foam. And some of our early beers, the foam stability was not very great, and so he recommended doing a pH adjustment to bring it below 4.7 pH, and that gets it out of that proteolytic range and really helps to preserve the foam. So we actually do it twice. We adjust in the kettle, and it seems to, by the time we bring it over the whirlpool, it wants to buffer back. So we always double check it once it's in the whirlpool, and if we have to adjust it again, we will adjust it to try to make sure that we're below 4.7 pH. And we just use regular lactic acid. It's not very much. It does not contribute at all to the flavor, but that a little bit of an adjustment of pH, bringing it from say 5.3 down to 4.7, makes a huge difference in the foam stability of the final product.
All right, so tell us what the fermentation looks like.
Yeah, so when we cool the beer down, we cool it down to regular ale fermentation temperatures, and then we have to move it out to our sour facility. We built trying to separate separate the two from any potential risk of cross-contamination. So we actually pump it into a tanker truck and bring it across town to our sour facility where we offload it, and that's where we pitch our mixed culture fermentation. Early on, we used to do separate fermentation tanks, but we just had a lot of issues with keeping our lactic acid tank free of ale yeast. It's the opposite of what you think. And so we've gone into doing 100% mixed culture fermentation, and we split it into, we now have new tanks that we are able to do the entire fermentation in a mixed fermentation within one fermenter. Fermentation is, low to mid six.
When you were splitting it before, were you just splitting it 50-50, or how was that?
Yeah, it's evolved over the years. When we first started off, it was a 50-50 split. We would ferment half with just nail yeast, half with just lactic acid bacteria. Then we went to almost an 80-20 because we had these transport totes that we could just do. It's about 20% of the wort that we would just pitch bacteria in, and then the rest was in that bigger tank. And now that we have tanks that we can actually ferment the entire batch in for primary fermentation, we'll do 100% now, where it's just a mixed culture fermentation. Offloading from the truck, we will pitch inline yeast and bacteria, and we will do, say, 5 to 6 days fermentation, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, just a regular ale fermentation. And after that time, the beer has a very, very light acidity. The pH is barely below a normal beer pH at the end of fermentation, and it's pretty bland. It's a not exciting beer, but you're kind of building the base at that point. So from there, we will transfer it into our cypress wood tanks, and inline we will pitch Brettanomyces, and that's really where the flavor begins to develop over time. We use 2 primary strains. One is a Brettanomyces bruxellensis, and the other one is a Brettanomyces clausenii. And both of those came from closed East German Berliner Weisse breweries. Both have very different flavor characteristics, and so depending what we're trying to accomplish, we'll pitch 1 or 2 or both of those strains. And this is where, time really slows down. It seems like almost, for a month, nothing really happens. It's once the Brett, which is notoriously slow acting, once that kind of gets acclimated and starts doing work, starts breaking down those dextrins, it's going to start liberating some simple sugars for the bacteria to start working on. Bacteria also works off of, autolysis. So you get this weird stretch where the primary culture starts to die off, and you get some of those autolysis flavors, and you start to sweat a little bit on thinking you screwed some stuff up, but you just got to be patient, and that's when the magic starts happening. You'll start seeing the gravity start to drop, then the pH starts to drop, and then your acidity start to building, and that's when that the Brett and the bacteria are starting to work together. And it really depends from there on what kind of the base beer is and what we're trying to accomplish. Our shortest beer we've ever done is 6 months. So our longest, I'm looking at a tank here that now has been in here for coming up on 2.5 years, and it's still got some time to go yet. So it really depends on what we're trying to accomplish, and again, going back to that variability of pitching rates and stuff, that also determines how long the beer is going to age inside one of our tanks.
Wow. Okay. And I know you said you bottle condition. Do you also do any draft with this as well, or is it only bottled product?
Yeah, so we do everything we do, draft our bottles is bottle conditioned. Wanted to be as traditional as possible, and I also think that having that re-fermentation in the bottle just adds another little layer of complexity, and I think that really helps with that tight foam that you get from a naturally conditioned beer. So when the beer that a tank is ready, that we like that flavor profile, we will transfer it back into stainless, and then we do it in batches where we'll pitch a fresh sugar. We just use dextrose, and then we use a bottle conditioning yeast. Because our beers age so long, most of that regular, the primary fermentation yeast is dead. And so to rely solely on Brettanomyces to recarbonate a beer, I don't think would be very reproducible. So trying to take that out of the equation, and so we always pitch Lalaman CBC1, which works great. We dose both of them inline. They're hand bottled still. We cork and cage all of our bottles, and then we hold it for now we've gone up to 2 months of bottle conditioning. The beer is basically fully carbonated within 2 weeks, but it just seems like that the beer gets a little bit of bottle shock, and that if you give it 2 months, that it really kind of works out its little weird flavors. It kind of goes through like a mini, we call it the dirty sock phase, where Brett kind of kicks up and it kicks off these like kind of weird flavor. So it works through that. You can, if there's any issues with THP, is kind of that soggy Cheerio flavor. We try and store them very warm, 75 degrees or warmer, and it can work through those off flavors. And sometimes we have to sit on them longer, but we've gone to now where we age them for 2 months minimum.
Awesome. Okay, so you've now been doing this for something like 7 years, I think. It's a pretty complicated process with a lot of opportunities for surprises or disaster. What have been some of the biggest challenges or scariest moments?
There's been a lot. We've definitely dumped a lot of beer, and I think for anyone, and I think that goes, for any style of beer that you're making, if you know that the beer is bad, just dump it and move on. It's not worth trying to push a bad product on the consumers. I think that's only going to damage your reputation, and especially for sour beers, where you're already starting off with a niche product and trying to introduce people to it. It's only going to hurt you further. So we've had issues, that there was one beer that found out we had a crack in one of the glycol jackets, that the batch was contaminated. So after a year, we had to dump it. I remember coming in one day after Christmas, and it was extremely cold in our cellar, and 5 of the 10 tanks were leaking all at the same time. Oh, no. Because we were not monitoring the humidity in our cellar. And so that was a day of just utter chaos and panic, trying to get them to swell and rehydrate and stop the leaking.
How did you do that?
It's a lot of hot water. I have a hoop driver and a hammer, so a lot of trying to drive down the hoops of the tanks to trying to get them to hold again. We still have some of the original pitch from when they were pitch lined. So I'd use a torch and just jamming pitch inside of them, trying to get it to stop. It's been a long process, and definitely a labor of love with all the things that we've had go wrong.
Wow, and like you said, you're trucking the wort over to a separate building. Any unique challenges with that? Has that been a big headache?
Oh yeah, we first started in totes, and we would move 4 totes at a time, and that was cleaning 4 separate tanks, and then we had to do 2 trips. So it was just like days of CIPing these tanks just to move it over, the small portions at a time. We finally found like a bulk tank truck to work that also carries milk, and the driver assured us that those tanks his truck would be absolutely clean. And when he showed up, we unscrewed the cap, and you could see this little trail of white liquid coming out of the tank. We're like, nope, this is not going to work. So we've since we get the truck goes as a kosher wash, which is a certified sterilized wash. So that was a learning process too, with just transferring wort and the contamination risk that comes with that. So that's been another learning curve as well with moving to offsite.
That was Jace Marti here on the Master Brewers podcast. Check out the presentation that Jace gave at District Mid-South. I'll post a link in the show notes, or you can get there by typing Berliner into the industry's best search bar at MBAA.com. And don't forget, you have to be both a Master Brewers member and logged in to see all of the search results. Are you enjoying the Master Brewers podcast? Let me tell you about a simple way you can help us keep making more. Take a minute to thank our sponsors. There's no way we could produce this show without generous support from sponsors like Hopsteiner, ABS, Proximity Malt, White Labs, and BSG. So please let them know you heard their message on the Master Brewers podcast and that you appreciate their support. It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. You can find all the details on the meetings tab at mbaa.com.
My fist full of courage, my heart full of rage. Well, I can't get stuck, I can't be losing too much, and then I'm heading out to any other place. My fist full of courage, my heart full of rage. Well, I can't get stuck, I can't be losing too much.